Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling something, well, let's face it, it's crazy relevant right now, right? Tolerance.
Definitely a hot topic these days.
We're diving into a brand new book, Tolleranza, that's Tolerance in Italian, by Luigi Marco Bassani.
Great book.
It takes us all the way, get this, from ancient Rome to, well, all the debates raging today, you know?
It really highlights how something like tolerance, we think, oh yeah, pretty simple, right? But it's got this wild history full of contradictions you wouldn't believe.
Totally. So, to kick things off, how about we rewind? Way back, ancient Rome. Toga parties, gladiators, the Colosseum, the whole bit. You'd think an empire like that, they'd be all about, like, forcing their beliefs on everyone.
Yeah. It's what we tend to think
Yeah.
about empires, yeah.
Yeah.
But early Roman religion, surprisingly open. Like, they were totally cool with bringing in all kinds of gods from all over the place.
Right.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they had temples for every god under the sun, and a lot of them, they came from the very cultures Rome, well, conquered.
Interesting. So Bassani talks about how they basically had this, like, divine melting pot going on.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about adding new statues to the collection. They wanted to, like, integrate these new gods, sometimes even combine them with their own.
So was this just, like, a PR move to keep the conquered folks happy? Or was there something more to this whole open-minded religion thing?
Probably a little of both. Incorporating those local gods totally helped legitimize their rule, build some unity in the empire. But it also shows how practical they were. Different cultures, different beliefs. Why force everyone into the same box, right?
Which makes that whole altar to the unknown god thing even more interesting, don't you think?
For sure. Like, they didn't know everything, and they were open to, like, whatever else might be out there.
Okay, so fast forward to today. Most of us aren't building altars anytime soon, so what's the takeaway for us?
It's about realizing we don't have all the answers and being open to new ideas, even challenging ones. It's easy to get stuck in our own little bubbles, especially these days, right? But the Romans, they remind us to stay curious, to be okay with not knowing. You never know what you might learn.
Right. And it's kind of ironic, right? This empire, famous for their armies and conquests, they were also surprisingly open-minded when it came to religion. Well, at least for a while. Bassani doesn't shy away from some of the, let's say, less tolerant parts of Roman history either.
Definitely. And the persecution of early Christians. That's a
Yeah.
prime example. Even the most tolerant societies have their limits, their breaking points.
Yeah, it wasn't all togas and open arms. What made the Christians different? Why single them out?
That's where the whole political side of tolerance gets really interesting. Remember, Roman religion, it was totally tied up with the state, with politics. Acknowledge the emperor, that meant acknowledging the gods. The whole thing was interconnected.
Like one big power structure.
Exactly. And Christians, they refused to worship the Roman gods. They wouldn't acknowledge the emperor as divine. They were directly challenging that whole system.
So it wasn't just their beliefs, but what those beliefs represented.
Precisely. One god and a higher power outside of Rome. That was subversive, even treasonous. Rome could tolerate other faiths, sure.
Yeah.
But Christianity, it was a unique threat. They felt they had to crush it.
It really makes you think, right? Tolerance often has these, like, invisible boundaries,
Yeah.
even if they seem completely random looking back.
Absolutely. And those boundaries,
Yeah.
usually drawn by those in power based on their own agendas and fears.
Which brings us to a pivotal moment, a real turning point in the history of tolerance, and someone who embodies that tension between acceptance and, well, oppression, Emperor Constantine.
Talk about shaking things up. Constantine embraces Christianity in the 4th century CE, and boom, the Roman Empire does a complete 180.
He totally flipped the script. Christianity goes from public enemy number one to the official religion practically overnight.
All right.
What's Bassani's take on this? Was this a win for tolerance or a step backwards?
It's complicated. On the one hand, Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 CE legalizes Christianity. Huge step for religious freedom.
Right.
After centuries of persecution, they could finally worship openly.
Sounds pretty tolerant to me.
It was huge. But, and this is key, it didn't create some perfectly tolerant utopia. Over time, Christianity, it gets more and more entangled with the state, with the government, and other religions, including the old Roman gods. They were out.
The persecuted become the persecutors.
Exactly. There wasn't a total eradication of other faiths, but this set the stage for centuries. The idea that political power and religion, they're two sides of the same coin.
Which brings us to the Middle Ages. The Catholic Church is calling the shots in Europe. We're talking Charlemagne, the Crusades. Not exactly the poster children for tolerance.
That's one way to put it. You're right to bring up those examples. The medieval period, religious orthodoxy was everything. Charlemagne's campaigns to force Christianity on pagan tribes, the Crusades against Muslims. It was all about using power to make everyone believe the same thing.
Convert or die,
Yeah.
basically. But even in this era of religious, well, let's call it what it was, fanaticism, Bassani finds some surprising nuances, right? He mentions thinkers like Thomas Aquinas. He was arguing for tolerating things even if they seemed wrong.
Right. It's fascinating. Aquinas, we're talking 13th century here, he says, sometimes you gotta let things slide, even if you don't like them. It's all about preventing something worse.
Like, pick your battles.
Exactly. Trying to stamp out every little vice or heresy, it could backfire. Sometimes it's better to tolerate something bad to avoid a bigger disaster.
That's a pretty pragmatic viewpoint,
Yeah, I know.
especially for a guy considered one of the church's top thinkers.
It shows that even in periods we think of as totally rigid, people were wrestling with the idea of tolerance. How do you balance your values with keeping society from falling apart? There are no easy answers.
It really makes you wonder, what would Aquinas tolerate today? What would he say about the world we live in?
It's a question worth considering, and it leads us perfectly to the next chapter, the Reformation. Buckle up. Things are about to get messy.
So we left off with Thomas Aquinas and his idea that sometimes we got to tolerate a little bad to prevent something worse, and then bam, the Reformation explodes onto the scene and tolerance is really put to the test.
Yeah, no kidding. The Reformation, it totally shattered Europe's religious landscape. Martin Luther challenges the Catholic Church in 1517, and it unleashed decades of brutal conflict, different factions all fighting for power.
Total religious wars, right?
Oh.
Catholics against Protestants, and even Protestants against other Protestants. Not exactly peaceful coexistence.
It was incredibly divisive. Religious identity got all tangled up with politics, with your whole sense of self. Tolerance, there wasn't much to go around.
Okay, so picture this. It's France in the 16th century. The country is ripping itself apart over religion. We're talking massacres, executions. It's a mess. But into this chaos steps a group of thinkers Bassani calls the politiques. Who were these guys? What made them so radical?
The politiques, they were basically pragmatists. They were looking for a way out of this cycle of violence. They saw how these religious conflicts were tearing France apart, leaving it wide open to enemies.
So less about theology, more about, like, just making things work.
Exactly. They weren't trying to decide who had the right religion. They just wanted to restore order, even if it meant compromising on some beliefs.
And that's where Jean Baudin comes in, right, with his idea of sovereignty.
Bingo. Baudin, he was a major figure among the politiques. His book, 6 Books of the Commonwealth, published in 1576, super influential.
Okay, so break it down for us. What's the big deal with sovereignty?
Baudin said that for a state, a country, to actually function, it needs one ultimate authority, the sovereign. Could be a king, a queen, even a ruling council, but this sovereign. They have the final say on everything, including religion.
So instead of the church being the ultimate authority, it's the state.
Exactly. It was a huge shift, and it had huge implications for tolerance. Because if the sovereign's power doesn't depend on everyone believing the same thing, suddenly allowing different faiths, it's not such a crazy idea.
Makes sense. If you want a strong, stable nation, all that religious infighting starts to look like a liability, not a strength.
Exactly. And this leads us to a pretty remarkable moment. The Edict of Nantes in 1598.
Which Bassani calls a high point for religious tolerance in France. What made it so groundbreaking?
Well, after decades of brutal religious wars, King Henry IV, who was actually raised Protestant but converted to Catholicism, he issues this edict. It grants significant rights and freedoms to the Huguenots.
Wait, remind me, the Huguenots were...
French Protestants.
Yeah.
And the Edict of Nantes. It let them practice their faith openly in certain areas. They even got a degree of political autonomy.
After all that bloodshed and persecution, that's hard to even imagine.
Right. It was a remarkable act of, choosing pragmatism over ideology. But of course, good things don't always last, especially when it comes to tolerance.
Oh boy, here comes the but.
Yep. Fast forward to 1685, and Louis XIV, the Sun King, he revokes the Edict of Nantes.
Talk about a step backwards.
It was devastating for the Huguenots. Thousands fled France to avoid persecution. Others were forced to convert to Catholicism. Tolerance, even when it's the law, can be incredibly fragile.
It's like progress isn't a straight line, is it?
Yeah.
Sometimes it feels like we're taking 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sometimes even 2 steps back.
It's a pattern we see again and again, unfortunately. But while France was backsliding in other parts of Europe, tolerance was gaining ground, each with its own unique story.
Like where? Bassani talks about England and the Netherlands.
Right.
two places that were really key in shaping modern ideas about tolerance.
Absolutely. England, for instance, they were dealing with their own religious turmoil in the 17th century. This is the era of the English Civil War, Catholics, different Protestant groups, all vying for power.
So we left off talking about 17th century England. It was a chaotic time, right? The English Civil War, Catholics, Protestants, all fighting for control. Not exactly a breeding ground for tolerance. It was a wild time, for sure. But even then, amidst all that chaos, some people were advocating for more religious freedom. John Milton, for example, he was a huge champion for free speech. Oh yeah, Milton. He wrote that famous piece, Areopagitica, right? A passionate defense of a free press. Basically, the 17th century version of let people speak their minds.
Exactly. Milton saw censorship as a form of tyranny. He thought it stifled truth and trapped society in ignorance. He believed that even dangerous or offensive ideas, they should be debated openly, not silenced.
Pretty radical for his time. People were still getting burned at the stake for heresy back then, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. But even Milton, as much as he championed free expression, he had his limits, all that talk about tolerance, he still deeply distrusted Catholics, didn't want to give them the same freedoms.
It's a good reminder that even the biggest advocates for tolerance, well, they usually have their blind spots, right? Something we're still dealing with today.
Absolutely. It's easy to preach tolerance in theory, but when you come across beliefs that challenge your own, that's when it gets really difficult.
So, England in the 17th century, a mixed bag to say the least.
Yeah.
What about the Netherlands? Bassani paints them as a haven of tolerance, especially compared to places like England and France.
The Netherlands in the 17th century, absolutely remarkable. Thinkers, religious minorities, they all flocked there to escape persecution, like an early Silicon Valley, but for ideas instead of tech startups.
What made them so open-minded?
Well, for one, they knew what it was like to be persecuted for their beliefs. They'd been under Spanish rule, remember? Fought hard for their independence, and they came out of it with a fierce commitment to liberty and freedom of conscience.
Tolerance born from experience, not just some abstract idea. I like that.
Right. And it wasn't just principle. The Dutch were becoming a major economic power. Amsterdam, a global center of trade. People from all over the world were pouring in.
So they realized being open to different cultures wasn't just the right thing to do. It was good for business.
Exactly. Tolerance became part of their recipe for success.
And some of the most influential voices for tolerance emerged during this time, right? Thinkers like Pierre Bayle and John Locke.
Exactly. Bayle, for example, was a French Huguenot. He fled to the Netherlands to escape persecution, became a huge advocate for religious tolerance. He even defended atheists, can you believe it? Practically unheard of back then.
Wow, now that's pushing the boundaries. Basically saying, hey, you don't have to believe in God to have a voice.
Exactly. Bayle believed that forcing religion on people only created hypocrisy, not true faith.
Which leads us to John Locke. He's the one who really pushed the idea of separating church and state.
Right. Locke's letter concerning toleration, published in 1689, a landmark work on religious freedom. He argued the government has no business interfering with individual conscience.
Didn't Locke's ideas have a big influence on the American colonists?
Huge. Many of the founding fathers, they were big fans of Locke. His ideas about religious freedom, they're woven into the fabric of the United States. The First Amendment, separation of church and state, freedom of religion, speech, the press, it's all there.
It's incredible when you think about it. These ideas we take for granted today, they were radical, even dangerous, just a few centuries ago.
Yeah.
It makes you appreciate how far we've come in terms of tolerance and individual rights.
It really does. But it's a reminder that the fight for tolerance is never over. Every generation faces new challenges, new temptations to exclude those who are different.
And that, my friends, brings us to today. We've traveled from ancient Rome to the Enlightenment. So what does Bassani say about tolerance in the modern world? That's the million-dollar question, and one we should all be thinking about. So keep those brains buzzing, and thanks for joining us for this deep dive into tolerance.